So, guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Does anybody not understand German? Does anybody not understand? Everybody understands German? A bit? Well, the point is, if everybody understands German, I would give the introduction in German. Otherwise, I switch into English. I mean, you have to decide. You don't understand it very well?
For the introduction is okay.
You're sure?
Kein Problem.
Kein Problem. Okay. Also, ich habe die Einleitung natürlich auf Englisch vorbereitet. Ich werde jetzt frei sprechen in Deutsch und hoffe, dass ich Sie also einigermaßen gut zu Karl Monsmas Vortrag hinbekommen werde. Also erstmal herzlich willkommen hier am Hamburger Institut für Sozialforschung. Schön, dass Sie hierher gefunden haben, trotz des relativ schönen Wetters und trotz Fußball. Wir werden keine Zwischenergebnisse durchgeben und werden uns ganz auf die Thematik konzentrieren. Wir werden heute einen Talk haben, ein Gespräch danach über ein Topic, den ich zunächst mal einführen werde. Es geht um Sklaverei und Karl Monsma, den ich später dann vorstellen werde, wird sozusagen zu dieser Thematik reden. Warum eigentlich Sklaverei? Warum über Sklaverei reden hier in Hamburg? Und warum über Sklaverei reden, vielleicht hier am Hamburger Institut für Sozialforschung. Und ich versuche das zu Beginn ein bisschen zu erklären, bevor ich dann zu Karl Monsma überleite und er dann sozusagen das Wort ergreifen wird. Also vielleicht, warum die Frage der Sklaverei gerade auch das Hamburger Institut einigermaßen stark interessieren sollte, will ich ausholen, und zwar zurückgehen auf ein Buch, das 1944, also während des Zweiten Weltkriegs, geschrieben wurde von einem sehr berühmt werdenden Historiker und Politiker aus Trinidad. Ich sage 1944, Capitalism and Slavery. Ja, das war sozusagen ein sehr, sehr großes, bedeutend werdendes Buch, das eine bestimmte These vertreten hat. Die These war ungefähr folgende: dass die britische Industrialisierung, die eben ab 1760, wie auch immer, begann, sehr stark geprägt war im Prinzip durch die Plantagenökonomien, vor allem in den Westindies. Und diese Art der Plantagenökonomie, betrieben auf der Basis von Sklaverei, schuf enorme Profite und erlaubte es der britischen kapitalistischen Industrialisierung mehr oder minder auf Dauer gestellt zu werden. Ja, und das war eine damals, ich glaube, relativ revolutionäre These, weil es gab nicht allzu viele Leute, die den Zusammenhang von Industrialisierung im Westen mit Sklaverei und Plantagenökonomie in der Karibik oder so in Zusammenhang brachten. Und mit diesem Buch wurde dieser Politiker und Historiker aus Trinidad relativ bekannt. Zunächst einmal auch deswegen relativ bekannt, weil dieses Buch, das er 1944 veröffentlichte, auch sofort sehr, sehr scharf kritisiert wurde und letztendlich sozusagen bestimmte Teile der These einer starken Kritik unterzogen worden sind. Diese These von dem Williams schlief und dämmerte vor sich hin, ich glaube, man kann fast sagen, vielleicht 40 oder 50 Jahre, bis dann im Zuge des Aufkommens der sogenannten Global History diese These wieder enorm einflussreich wurde. Und ich will Sie jetzt ganz kurz in diese Debatten um die Global History in ganz wenigen Sätzen einführen, um Ihnen zu demonstrieren, um was es hier denn eigentlich geht. Um das Jahr 2000 rum veröffentlichten vor allem zwei renommierte, in Amerika lehrende China-Historiker, Roy Bin Wong und Kenneth Pomeranz, Bücher, die dann sozusagen eine Debatte prägten, die einging in die Geschichtswissenschaft unter den Titel The Great Divergence, das große Auseinandertreten, würde man sagen. Und die Frage stellte sich, warum entwickelte sich um 1760 in England und hier in einem bestimmten Teil Englands die industrielle Revolution und nicht im Yangtze-Delta in China, das zur damaligen Zeit in etwa ökonomisch gleichermaßen fortgeschritten war wie entsprechende Gebiete in England. Also man hat relativ prosperierende Gebiete, man hat relativ starken Handel, man hat eine prosperierende Agrarökonomie, aber nur in einem Teilland, nämlich sozusagen in England, sozusagen beginnt die industrielle Revolution und in China bleibt sie aus. Und die Antwort, die in dieser Great Divergence-Debatte gegeben wurde, die Antwort ist natürlich, wie alles in der Wissenschaft umstritten, lautete, coal and colonies. Die Tatsache, dass in England Kohle, das soll uns jetzt nicht weiter interessieren, sehr viel leichter verfügbar war als in China, aber vor allem, und das interessiert uns jetzt, die Tatsache, dass England zur damaligen Zeit Kolonien hatte, führte dazu, so war die Argumentation um 2000, führte dazu, dass die industrielle Revolution deswegen auf Dauer gestellt werden konnte, weil in diesen Bereichen Amerikas, wo die Plantagenökonomie existierte, dauerhafte Absatzmärkte für diese Produkte der industriellen Revolution geschaffen werden konnten. Die Sklaven mussten ernährt werden, mussten eingekleidet werden, die Plantagenbesitzer und Sklavenhalter sozusagen kauften Güter und das schuf sozusagen zum ersten Mal die Möglichkeit, dass eine Massenproduktion auf industrieller Basis letztendlich dann auch quasi auf Dauer gestellt werden konnte, weil sich Industrialisierung und maschineller Einsatz letztendlich lohnten. Wenn man jetzt nun von Kolonien redet, redet man natürlich wenn man sozusagen irgendwie realitätsblind ist, immer auch von Sklaven. Und es ist, glaube ich, kein Zufall, dass wenige Jahre dann nach diesem Buch von Pomeranz und anderen, 2002, ebenfalls ein wichtiges Buch erschien von Joseph Inikori, einem, ich glaube, aus Nigeria stammenden Historiker, der nochmal sozusagen den Punkt klar machte, die Afrikaner und die Versklavung der Afrikaner, von verschiedenen Afrikanern, von vielen Afrikanern und kapitalistische Industrialisierung gehen irgendwie Hand in Hand. Und wenn man nun diese ernst nimmt, glaube ich, dann kann man sozusagen jetzt Folgendes sagen. Auch wenn die Thesen natürlich wie alles in der Geschichtswissenschaft immer umstritten sind, man wird nach dieser Great Divergence-Debatte und nach den Büchern von Williams und Inikori nicht mehr davon ausgehen können, dass die Entstehung, Genese und Entwicklung des Kapitalismus ein friedlicher Prozess war, ja, der in irgendeiner Weise durch eine, denken Sie an Max Weber, asketische Lebensführung herbeigeführt wurde, sondern diese Genese und Ausgestaltung des Kapitalismus war immer massiv begleitet von massiver Gewalt und massiver Gewalt heißt immer auch Sklaverei. Und mit dieser Einsicht wird natürlich dann die ursprüngliche Idee, vielleicht von Karl Marx, über die ursprüngliche Akkumulation immer interessanter, die lange Zeit keine große Rolle mehr spielte, auch wenn man heute sagen würde, man müsste die ursprüngliche Akkumulation anders begründen, als sie Marx vor 150 Jahren begründet hat. Aber Gewalt und ursprüngliche Akkumulation, um den Kapitalismus aufs Gleis zu setzen, war und ist vermutlich immer wichtig. Warum ist es jetzt für unseren heutigen Talk wichtig? Ich glaube, es ist wichtig sozusagen aus zwei Gründen und damit komme ich dann auch gleich zur Vorstellung von Karl Monsma. Es ist deswegen wichtig, erstens, weil Hamburg gerade dabei ist, seine koloniale Vergangenheit aufzuarbeiten, das wissen Sie, sowohl in der Politik als auch in der Zivilgesellschaft geht es jetzt momentan darum, aufzuarbeiten, wie diese extrem reiche Kaufmannschaft vom Kolonialismus letztendlich profitiert hat und Kolonialismus heißt immer auch Sklavenhandel. Ja, also es ist hier in Hamburg und ich glaube, Hamburg ist da im deutschen Vergleich Vorreiter, eine extrem starke Bewegung vorhanden, um dieses koloniale Erbe der Stadt mehr oder minder aufzuarbeiten. Ich glaube, deswegen lohnt es sich schon, letztendlich sich unter anderem mit dieser Thematik der Sklaverei hier in Hamburg gerade zu beschäftigen. Und der zweite Punkt, warum diese Thematik auch für das HIS und für bestimmte Bereiche der Hamburger Öffentlichkeit auch wichtig sind oder der deutschen Öffentlichkeit. Wann immer man über Sklaverei redet, und das gilt auch für die Sklaverei in Brasilien, klar muss sein, dass wir in diesem Zusammenhang immer von einem Sachverhalt reden, der in die Geschichtswissenschaft als Entangled History eingegangen ist. Also die Sklaverei, wo auch immer sie stattgefunden hat und praktiziert worden ist immer auch mehr oder minder geführt worden und eingeführt worden und aufbewahrt worden und durchgeführt worden, um letztendlich das kapitalistische Weltsystem, wenn man also Immanuel Wallerstein bemühen will, am Laufen zu halten. Ja, und deswegen ist es, glaube ich, immer wichtig, sich mit diesen Dingen zu beschäftigen. Und Sklavenrevolten, das ist sozusagen das Thema von Karl Monsma heute, haben natürlich immer was auch damit zu tun, dass Brasilien auch als unabhängiges Land im 19. Jahrhundert mehr oder minder in dieses kapitalistische Weltsystem eingebunden war. Damit komme ich jetzt zum Thema und will Ihnen Karl Monsma ganz kurz vorstellen. Karl Monsma ist Professor für Soziologie an der Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul. Er ist ein theoretisch extrem ausgewiesener und auch ambitionierter ich würde sagen, historischer Soziologe. Das, glaube ich, ist das, was ihn sozusagen und seine Arbeiten im Kern auszeichnet. Und seine Expertise liegen in unterschiedlichen Forschungsfeldern, aber sicherlich in dem Bereich der Migration und Einwanderung, im Bereich des Rassismus, im Bereich der ethnischen Identitäten und im Bereich der Gewalt. Ja, gerade heute werden wir auch unter anderem über Gewalt und Sklavenrevolten einiges von ihm erfahren. Monsma ist, wenn ich richtig informiert bin, gleichzeitig brasilianischer und US-amerikanischer Staatsbürger. Er ist in den USA akademisch erzogen worden. Einer seiner frühen Lehrer war William Domhoff, den vielleicht einige von Ihnen kennen, weil Domhoff quasi der Zeichner der amerikanischen Eliten war, also jemand, der sehr stark die amerikanische Elite immer analysiert und untersucht hat als Politikwissenschaftler und Soziologe. Und ein weiterer akademischer Lehrer war dann sein Supervisor in der Dissertation, nämlich Jeffrey Page, der auch ein sehr, sehr berühmtes Buch über Revolutionen geschrieben hat, auch ein sehr, sehr berühmter historischer Soziologe. Schwierig bei Karl Monsma ist die Einordnung, obwohl ich vorher sagte, historischer Soziologe, aber man könnte ihn auch, und er ist es auch, als Anthropologen bezeichnen oder eben auch als Historiker. Also die, wie soll man sagen, disziplinäre Zuordnung ist nicht so ganz einfach und es bedeutet, er arbeitet interdisziplinär. Und ich will jetzt in diesem Zusammenhang nur zwei Publikationen nennen. Rangers, Rural People and the State in Postcolonial Argentina, also ein Buch auch schon zu Südamerika, diesmal zum spanischen Südamerika, das glaube ich war seine Dissertation, die in den frühen 1990er Jahren geschrieben worden ist. Und jüngst herausgekommen ist ein Buch auf Portugiesisch, ich habe es hier mitgebracht, zur Reproduktion des Rassismus, Großgrundbesitzer, schwarze Sklaven und Einwanderer im São Paulinischen Gebiet in der Zeit zwischen 1880 und 1914, also einem bestimmten Teil von Brasilien. Darüber wird zum Teil auch natürlich sein heutiger Talk gehen. Ganz kurz noch will ich nicht verschweigen und sind wir natürlich auch besonders stolz drauf. Karl Monsma, der jetzt seit 20 Jahren in Brasilien lebt, ist jetzt hier am HIS schon fast ein Jahr. Er ist hier Gastprofessor seit Sommer 2017 und wir sind stolz, dass er hier ist und wir freuen uns auch, dass er sozusagen zu diesem Anlass auch einen Talk gibt, eine Rede, einen Vortrag und der Titel wird lauten The Collapse and Reconstruction of Systems of Domination, Two Brazilian Slave Revolts and Their Aftermath. Karl, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to try to see if I can. Yes. That is the title of the talk. I'm going to be talking about, well, here's a general outline. Let's start with capitalism. Capitalism also needs stimulants. Coffee from Brazil is definitely part of keeping people working and stimulating intellectual activity and so on. The main product of Rio Grande do Sul in the period I'm analyzing is what's called jerk beef or salted beef, which is used mainly for feeding slaves in the rest of Brazil. I mean, so it's all interconnected. The main theoretical considerations here are really betraying my old advisor, who probably doesn't like Bill Sewell at all, but William Sewell and Andrew Abbott, and then talk about how these developed. And I have far too much material, so I will try not to rush too much. And let's see. Just a little bit about the two contexts. This is a map from the early 19th century of Rio Grande do Sul and Uruguay, which is interesting because it does not show the border, which is more or less how people at the time perceived it. The current border goes from here in Jaguarão and then goes way up north here. And in the war with Argentina, which the Brazilians call the Cisplatin War, starting in 1812, the Portuguese, at that time Brazil was still not independent, occupied all of today's Uruguay, and Brazilian ranchers occupied everything north of the Rio Negro, which this map is not entirely accurate, but on this map, this huge space of ranching country here. So you have two countries completely interpenetrating one another in this frontier area. Another thing that's not accurate here, this Lago dos Patos here is the largest lake in South America. It's probably about 3 times as large as this other lake, but they look about the same. In any case, another thing. This is an old painting by a French painter. Slaughtering cattle at one of the jerk beef factories. These half moon-like things are used for cutting the steers' hamstrings, and then they can be killed more. I mean, this is a dangerous job. These are semi-wild cattle. They don't really appreciate being killed. So, you know, there's a lot of and these are mainly slaves working in this. For a long time, there was this kind of ideological position that slaves just can't do this. They can't do that. They can't work in industry. They can't be cowboys and so on. And we're finding out more and more slaves did everything. And so over the past 20 years, there's been accumulating evidence that there were slaves everywhere in this ranching economy. They were used mainly as permanent workers, and then they were supplemented on a seasonal basis by free workers. So part of what got me interested in this, aside from the fact that I live in this region now, is how do you control slaves on horseback who work with weapons and, you know, are armed? And well, the short answer to this is clientelism. You know, you treat them better than other slaves, you divide them, you individualize them, and also a lot of them did escape. I mean, they're close to the border with Uruguay. After a certain point, they could get freedom by getting to Uruguay. Earlier on, informally, it would be much more difficult to capture them after they cross the international border, because there are ranchers on the other side who would hire them and protect them and so on. And there was a lot of civil war in Uruguay, so that the armies on both sides would accept them as soldiers, and then it would be very hard for the original owner to get them back. I've looked at the correspondence of ranching families, and often they do get caught when they're trying to escape. I mean, the ranchers know where they're going. They send other men after them, and then they're subject to horrible torture, you know, and punishment to make an example of them. It's really painful to read sometimes. The other thing is you treat them better than other slaves. There's always the threat that they could get sold off to the jerk beef factories, which is a much less pleasant kind of work. I mean, they work throughout the summer. It's the place, the stench is horrible. There's blood everywhere. They have sharp knives. They're always slipping and hurting themselves. Or they can get sold to the coffee plantations in central Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. So you have this kind of, and they also receive better food, better clothing, aguardiente, tobacco, and so on. So there's a certain degree of appreciation, and there's a rough equality with the free workers. That's interesting. The slaves are found gambling and drinking with the free workers. I mean, I find this because I look at a lot of criminal court proceedings, and, you know, they're gambling and they get in a fight, you know, so that's how you know that they're there. And probably the most effective form of control of all was the promise of freedom in exchange for loyal service. Now, it's more convincing if the ranch owner is a lot older than the slave, right? And it's typically, okay, the day I die, you will become free if you serve me loyally. It was not always, I mean, this was a promise, but, okay, heirs sometimes resisted implementing the promise, so that this would then result in court cases and so on. Okay, let me go on. The other great concentration of workers is in the jerk beef industry, which is concentrated around Pilotos here. I mean, the cattle come in off the plains, and then they can go by water to the central. Well, once they're transformed into meat, they go by water to the central parts of Brazil, and sometimes to Cuba. But Rio Grande do Sul is competing with jerk beef producers in Uruguay and Argentina, where conditions are better. I mean, the pasture is better, access to salt is better. It becomes an important part of the story. Okay, let me go on to São Paulo to contextualize it. This is more near the end of the 19th century. This map was organized by the Society for the Promotion of Immigration. Funny is this part, which informs the immigrants of the terrain they're going to have to cross to get where it's not exactly something that stimulates your desire to immigrate. But in fact, the terrain is like this closer to the coast. There's the coastal range, and then there's a higher range here. But coffee goes up this valley, the Paraíba Valley, through the early, mid-19th century, and then toward the late 19th century, it kind of explodes up into this northern area, which is really a rolling plateau. It's not nearly so mountainous. But when it was still slaves doing all the work, which is up until abolition in 1888, this is what it looked like. I mean, this is a photo. You have these things where Brazilian coffee is not the finest coffee in the world because it's not such high altitude. So they pick all the beans at the same time. They just pull it off, whereas fine high altitude coffee, you pick them individually when they get ripe. They come off with a whole lot of leaves and stuff, so you have these little baskets. You throw it up in the air for the leaves to blow away and the coffee cherries fall down, and then put it in the basket on your back. I mean, there are some different techniques for this, but that's what's going on here. And then a very important stage is drying the coffee. This is in the Paraíba River Valley, obviously, because more mountainous. And I think a stage photo. I mean, there's this supervisor here with his arm, like, hold your arm up for 5 minutes while we expire. But in any case, this is a very important stage. You have to dry out, because then they go to a machine that takes the pulp off. I mean, the coffee bean that you consume here is actually just the seed that's inside the fruit. So you have to take the pulp off the fruit. And first of all, have to dry it and rake them. Work on the coffee plantations is much more regimented. I mean, you need a lot more slaves to, not just in the harvest, which is certainly the most intense time of year, which is, late fall or early winter, with seasons reverse, and we're talking about May through August, which is also the dry season in this part of Brazil. But the rest of the year, you need to regularly weed. You have to go through it. Most of the plantations, especially the earlier ones, are established in an area that was formerly Atlantic rainforest, which has this amazing regenerative power. I mean, to this day, I used to live in the interior of São Paulo. Things just grow. You can almost see them growing all the time. So if you leave a coffee plantation for 2 years, it'll be choked by vines. You have to be constantly taking out weeds. And then there's a lot of other food planting and fence mending and so on that keeps people busy the rest of the time. Now, what I think are tools for thinking about continuity and change. I want to talk a little bit about William Sewell's work. I'm not sure how familiar people here are with it. Logics of History, Social Theory and Social Transformation. It's a synthesis of, well, it's kind of an extended critique of Marshall Sahlins' ideas. I mean, Sahlins is a structural anthropologist who's trying to figure out how social change is possible, within a strictly structuralist perspective, nothing ever changes. But it's a synthesis of ideas from Bourdieu and Sahlins and Giddens. For Sewell, change is always possible. It's much more possible than even somebody like Bourdieu with this structured improvisation of transposition of habitus from one situation to another. For Sewell, there's human creativity involved, and it's always possible that people are going to think something new, do something new. But typically, when they do something new, or especially when they have heterodox ideas or so on, typically it doesn't go anywhere, or it doesn't result in major changes. I mean, you can have lots of examples in medieval Europe, for example, of spontaneous atheism. Well, okay, the person is repressed, or the majority of people who have those kinds of thoughts don't even express them because they know what the consequences are likely to be. So it's only in certain circumstances that what Sewell calls ruptures, or different kinds of actions or thoughts and so on, really result in change. And this is when they reverberate across different institutional spheres. They coincide with other kinds of changes in other areas. So, I mean, there's other complexities here, but another thing that Sewell emphasizes quite a bit is that people in different social positions often use the same structures differently, so that you always have this potential for different understandings of what's going on in conflict and so on. For Sewell, events are occurrences that result in structural change. And when you have this kind of reverberation through, it kind of goes around through different spheres of life, but they tend to produce various forms of change in structures, change in the logic of causality, change in the meaning of categories. They also change the availability of resources to different groups. And the direction of change is largely unpredictable because of the complexity of interaction over time between different structural logics. So that we can say why change is unpredictable, but we can't predict change. Okay, but this sort of approach does have some limits. It tends to work better for rapid change. I mean, the case that Sewell spent most of his life studying is the French Revolution, and then the Revolution of 1848. It does not work quite so well for these sort of long changes that people only with hindsight look back and, yeah, things have really changed. That while they're living through it, they don't really realize that something is going on. One can adapt it, but it's not so easy to use for those kinds of things. And I think there are also some problems in relating individual lives to larger structural changes, and this is where Andrew Abbott comes in. So Abbott sort of made his career studying professional careers. I mean, that's where he got started. So he is particularly sensitive to this sort of interconnection between individual lives and larger structural contexts. And one thing I find particularly interesting here is his analysis of what he calls turning points. I mean, there's this essay on turning points in the book Time Matters, in which he emphasizes that a turning point is not really a difference between two steady states. It's a difference between two trajectories. So that you have change all along. It's that a trajectory is something in which change is more or less predictable. You have a series of stages that you go through, and then you have these turning points where you're not sure what's going to happen next. I mean, you finish your studies, for example, you're not sure if you're going to get a job. So, well, eventually you get a job, and then you're on a kind of a career track or something. Then suddenly you become unemployed, and everything is a mess again. And that kind of logic can be applied at different levels. I mean, all the way up to countries, a world system, and so on. But it seems to me that one of the characteristics of periods of especially rapid change, like what I'm looking at here, is that suddenly the trajectories of individuals and families and so on, they all get messed up at the same time. Well, everybody is not really sure what's going to happen. Okay, let me talk about how this plays out in the two different contexts, and then I especially want to get back to the restoration of order after. These are, I should say, I'm calling these slave rebellions, but they're not rebellions in the sense that people typically talk about with a revolutionary organization or so. They're more rebellion in the sense of James Scott. I don't know if you know, this is weapons of the weak of individuals who are running away. It's much of what's happening in the two contexts is massive flight of slaves. Slaves just sort of leaving their jobs and going away, abandoning plantations and so on. There's also attacks on, physical attacks, especially in the case of São Paulo. But this all has consequences, and it creates a problem for the restoration of order afterwards. Okay, what happened in Rio Grande do Sul in the first part of the 19th century? There's a conflict over taxes, because remember I mentioned that they're competing with Argentina and Uruguay, the salt and meat trade. And they're taxed at the same level, so that the producers in Rio Grande do Sul want some kind of protection. And furthermore, these ranchers who are established in northern Uruguay want freedom of movement for their cattle without paying taxes in order to get to the salted meat plants. So you've got this basically economic kind of competition. At the same time, you have overvalued Brazilian currency for other reasons, which makes it cheaper for planters in the rest of Brazil to buy meat from other sources and so on. This happens in a context of a weakened central state and centrifugal tendencies due to the fact that the first emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro I, has abdicated in favor of his son, who's only 5 years old. So that you have a regency. He would later actually become emperor when he's 15, but you have this more or less 10-year period, more than 10 years actually, in which you have elected regents who are running the executive branch. Put it that way. There is a elected assembly too, elected with high property qualifications for voting. The elite of Rio Grande do Sul also has long experience with warfare. I mean, because this is where the Spanish and the Portuguese colonial empires collided, where they met. And so there's repeated wars throughout the colonial period. They just got out of this Cisplatin War, and England brokered the peace treaty, which established the country of Uruguay really as a buffer zone between the two. It didn't work all that well, because throughout the 19th century, both countries are always interfering in Uruguayan internal politics. So, okay, you have this conflict, you have this context, weak central state, a kind of warlike elite, on horseback that can mobilize fast. You have one thing leading to another in a process of increasing polarization. So the rebels, who are called farroupilhas or farrapos, which is a word in Portuguese that just means rags. Some debate about the origin of this, maybe they're dressed in rags, probably has to do with the fact that they tied a red sash or bandana around their heads. That's referred to as a rag by other people. First, they occupied the city of Porto Alegre, which is the capital up here at the top of the lake system, where I live, actually. Forced the governor to flee, nominate the vice governor. The new governor sent by the central government, they actually invite him to come in, thinking that, they're doing this as a negotiating tactic. All they want is tax relief. And so they invite the new governor, and he refuses to come. He sets up a rival government in the city of Rio Grande, which is out where the lake empties out into the ocean, so that any ships going up to Porto Alegre have to get past him here. Then the Farrapos arrest an important military commander. After 10 months of occupation, the Imperial forces drive them out of the capital city. This is a year after the rebellion starts. It's only at that point that the rebels set up their headquarters on the southern plains and declare independence, and declare a republic. So this is not something that's inspired by Republican ideology to begin with. Republican ideology is available because of the neighboring countries are republics. So there's this example of the struggle for independence in those countries. So we have this escalating conflict among elites. What does this have to do with soldiers? Well, they find it expedient to start what does it have to do with slaves? They find it expedient to start drafting slaves as soldiers. Warring parties in Uruguay had done this in the past, and the cowboys especially make excellent soldiers. And they are typically set up as they call lanceros. They have these long lances. Here's there. One on the left is a Uruguayan painter retrospective. I think this exaggerates how well outfitted they are. Probably are more like the one on the right. The warmer months, even without a shirt, and bareback, maybe. But you can see the man with the sword doesn't really have much chance against the lance of the. And they formed, this is a war in which the numbers of people on both sides is numbered in the thousands. It's maybe 5,000 men on each side. It's not this huge thing, but it lasts for 10 years. They go, coming and going. And the slaves who enter the armed forces on the rebel side are promised promised freedom at the end of the struggle. And they make up something like a third up to a half of the army. The lanceros are the elite force. There are about 400 of them altogether. There's also the infantry, which are more likely to be Africans who never learned to ride. Well, they start doing this. They initially are drafting slaves of the royalists, but then a lot of other slaves run away and start joining them. Others run away to Uruguay or Argentina. Still others are drafted into the army and then desert from the army and go off to the neighboring countries. It's a situation in which, because the countryside is dangerous, it's much more difficult for ranchers or even the salted meat or jerk beef entrepreneurs to go after people who run away. And even people who do not ride horses, the case of many, the Africans are concentrated in the jerk beef industry. Well, that city is only about 100 kilometers or so north of the border, so that they can walk there in a few days. It would have been hard before, but now things are so chaotic in the countryside. And you find reports of ranches that are just left with no slaves at all. Everybody left. So, okay, here's some data about that. What we did here is we looked at the probate record, so that there's a lag. People have to die first. The owner has to die. And so there's a list of slaves, but then they also listed the slaves who had escaped in many cases. I mean, if they really gave up on finding them, they wouldn't be on the list. But you can see a war. The war starts in 1835 and goes up to 1845. And there's this big increase. It's not, big numbers. We only looked at 4 municipalities in the south, but there's clearly an effect there of the war. And it was hard to get a lot of these people back after the end of the war. So I think that process here is important. I mean, you have divisions among elites, but then some of the bolder slaves kind of run away, and then when it becomes clear that they got away with it, then the other ones start getting ideas too. So they start more and more leaving, either going to the rebel forces or going off to Uruguay. When they get to Uruguay, what do? Well, I have some data on this too. See, this again, there's not information on birthplace for everybody, so the numbers here are fairly small, but it's very interesting that, or first of all, it's not terribly surprising the cowboys are much more likely to leave than others because it's easier for them. The jerk beef workers less, but then the African cowboys especially, and this is consistent with our idea that, Africans had never accepted the fact that they were captured and then enslaved, and people who were born into slavery learn more how to work the system, how to get ahead within it. And then among the jerk beef workers, the opposite is true, probably because the Africans don't know the territory. They don't know where exactly they have to go. This is a list that was produced by a professional slave catcher after the war, then which a lot of the Brazilian ranchers commissioned him to go and basically kidnap and bring back their slaves. And he was brought to justice because he kind of extrapolated his commission. He also kidnapped free Uruguayans and brought them back. Free Uruguayan blacks. He himself was not exactly white. I mean, he's a mixed descent. But this was fairly common in Brazil. This is interesting mainly for showing the variety of occupations of people in all kinds of occupations who are escaping. The sailors are for me, an interesting category. It's water transport is with these lakes and rivers everywhere. It's important. There were a lot of enslaved sailors, and there's one case in which 5 of them take over the boat where they work and just sail the boat off to Uruguay. Okay, there's another longer list that was compiled by the government. Part of the demands for Uruguay to hand people over really after the war, and in the middle of negotiations with Uruguay to get Uruguay to sign a treaty for returning escaped slaves, which they do because the Brazilians forced them to in 1851. And there's some information in this on the trajectories of where people went and what they did. In many cases, they presented themselves to military commanders, and entered armed service in Uruguay. It's also clear that many of them went to work for ranchers who protected them, would hide them, when people were coming to get them. Some gained local fame. This is a case of one who's a cowboy and a musician who went off to the Argentine province of Corrientes, married another black Brazilian, and it became quite well known for traveling around and playing at dances all over the province. And his supposed owner knew this, was reporting it, but couldn't get him back. A lot of women who fled with men, but others fled on their own, or they found Uruguayan who promised them employment, who managed to smuggle them out. Okay, let's go on to São Paulo. That's. In São Paulo, I'd say the event abolition lasted from the end of the international slave trade in 1850 to at least 1888. There's the effective end of the transatlantic slave trade due to pressure from Britain. This results in a gradual decrease in the number of Africans. This is important because one of the main strategies of control had always been to pit the Africans and the Brazilian-born slaves against one another, privileging the Brazilian-born. There's increasing prices of slaves after the end of the trade. This means that the slaves are increasingly concentrated on large properties, on large plantations, and ordinary small family farmers and so on don't have any slaves anymore. Middle-class people often don't have slaves. This results in a great increase in support for abolitionism among the white middle class because they no longer have anything invested in the system. There's a great concentration of slaves in São Paulo. There's a tendency toward freedom in the rest of the country. The rest of the country, the majority of the black population is already free. This is not true in São Paulo because of the coffee boom. And they're buying slaves constantly from other provinces. There's growing rebelliousness throughout the 1870s and the 1880s. How did this happen? The monarchy has this project of kind of gradual, slow abolition and transition to, I think slavery is not so good for development of the country. If we're going to have capitalist development, we need to have free labor and so on. We need to attract immigrants. The immigrants don't come as long as there's slavery because they're afraid of being enslaved. So they start kind of nibbling away at the institution of slavery. In 1869, they prohibit the sale of children separate from their mothers, which is one of the main punishments you could use against slaves who didn't obey you. The Lei Rio Branco of 1871 is mainly known as a free womb law, which is true. So slavery is going to end, although those born after that time owe services to their masters until they reach the age of 21 or something. But another very important thing in this law is it gave slaves the right to purchase their own freedom. So slaves are starting to gain rights. And a lot of them try to do it. They hire themselves out and start, they have the right to basically have a savings account and then be evaluated by a panel of impartial judges, and the owner has to accept the money, has to. And they really dislike this, and this leads to a lot of conflict in which people are insisting on this right to buy their own freedom, and they regularly show up at the police delegates complaining that the master is not accepting this, the master is whipping them and torturing people for, having the audacity to try to buy their own freedom. So there's this, and this starts to undermine the authority of the planters. You have changes intended to promote a gradual transition that end up undermining the authority. There's numerous conspiracies, localized revolts in the 1880s. By the end of the 1880s, the radical white abolitionists get involved. Well, not all are white, we're just white and black. Circulating in the countryside, trying to foment slave revolts. Panic among the planters, attempts to organize armed militias, kind of private militias, but to control slaves. Attempts to use conditional emancipation to maintain control. This is a trick that didn't work. It was basically, if you agree to work for me for the next 5 years, then I will give you freedom. And typically the response is, well, no, but I'm leaving today. So it didn't work very well. There's mass flights. The city, especially the port city of Santos, which had this huge settlement of escaped slaves into other rural areas. And there's a key moment in all this in which the police delegates give up on chasing escaped slaves. They say, no, it's not. As long as they're orderly, as long as they're not violent, I'm not going to waste my time chasing after these enslaved workers on behalf of these coffee planters. So there's this evolving conflict between planters and slaves that ends up promoting a division among local elites. And these planters there's lots of complaints. I've read the police correspondence about, both sides. Planters trying to get the chief of police to put pressure on the local delegate. One of the delegates gets lynched by the planters for being abolitionists. There are police delegates who are sheltering slaves at their home, who are trying to buy their freedom and so on. All these divisions among whites and the imminent end of slavery encourage slave resistance. And this leads to a complete loss of planter authority on a lot of plantations. And real fear for their own personal safety, sometimes running away. Sometimes groups would go off to another plantation and try to get the slaves on the other plantation to rebel. The situation is getting so out of control that the monarchy ends up just decreeing abolition. Abolition with no compensation for the planters, which they had always thought that they would receive compensation for their slave property. So in both of these cases, we had very different kinds of labor systems and control and so on, but in both cases, you have these divisions emerging among whites that create opportunities for the enslaved population, and a process in which some of the bolder people flee or rebel, and then others go after when they realize that it's not nearly so risky as it was. Okay, go to restoration. To understand the restoration of systems of domination and changed circumstances, we have to think about what kinds of things continue and what kinds of things change. Much of what Sewell calls the built environment continues. These are not just buildings and the like, but routines and habits and skills. The distribution of resources can remain very unequal, and the resources are used intentionally for the purposes of restoration. In my book, which is about São Paulo after abolition, really identify 5 levels at which racism is perpetuated. Institutions, which is a lot of things, social networks, representations and ideologies, routines of social interaction, and habitus. All these levels are influenced by power and resources. And only some of these things changed in the rebellions I'm talking about here. So slave owners, former slave owners, could use the resources they had and the continuing institutions, networks, and so on to reimpose domination. And a big part of restoring some kind of normalcy is restoring individual and family trajectories and expectations about what's going to happen in the future. So how did this happen? in Rio Grande do Sul, now we're going back to these slave soldiers, especially those on horseback. The habitus, routines of daily interaction, social networks had all been radically transformed of these soldiers. But little had changed on the side of the slave owners. Only a minority of the rebels were really abolitionists. The others were kind of, okay, yeah, sure, if it's necessary to win the war, but that's not really what they wanted. So these black soldiers had been transformed by the experience of 10 years of war and would be very difficult to re-enslave. They'd been promised freedom, but neither the monarchy nor the rebel elite really wants to give it to them. And peace negotiations really favored the slave owners. This apparently was because of a kind of looming war with Argentina, that the monarchy wanted to make sure the local elite was on their side. So they agreed to a 25% tax on the jerk beef coming from the Rio de la Plata area. The provincial president was also be selected by the provincial assembly and not the central government. All of the rebel officers gained amnesty and could enter the Imperial army at the same level. And then Brazil imposed this treaty for the return of fugitive slaves on Uruguay. But what happened with these enslaved soldiers? Part of restoration was literally the physical replacement of the enslaved population. Neither the monarchy nor the local elite wanted a mass liberation of a cohesive group of black warriors who could stimulate slave rebellions or lead to the formation of rural black bandit gangs. The most famous episode here, and one that's really historians and traditionalists, this is a very active political issue in Rio Grande do Sul today, is what's called the Porongos massacre. And that was... This is a monument that was erected only in 2004 at the site where this happened. This is one of the core of the Lance Corps, the Lanceros Negros. They are separated by their commander, and they're sleeping, and they're disarmed. They're in the middle of peace negotiations already, so that they're supposedly not actively fighting. They're surrounded at 2 o'clock in the morning by royalist forces and massacred. There are only about 20 of them survive. All the rest are killed. The commander had ignored warnings that royalist troops were approaching and gone to visit friends on a nearby ranch. Also about 300 whites captured but not killed. And there's a letter in the historical archive as part of this big debate now, which from the supreme commander of the royalist forces, which seems to indicate that the massacre was all agreed to by that both sides wanted to eliminate these enslaved soldiers. There's some debate about this. Some say it's a falsification and so on. But what's clear is that they were massacred. They were abandoned there. Some others followed another general into exile in Uruguay. He had a ranch there, and he employed them on his ranch. Others, quite a few escaped to Uruguay during the war, but probably at the end of the war as well. Others were offered freedom in the peace treaty. There's a student who did a PhD thesis in the last few years to try to track them down. What happened to them? They weren't really given freedom. They were treated like the group that was called the Freed Africans, who were, after the end of slave trade, if the Brazilian state caught a slaving ship, then the Africans on the ship were considered free Africans, but in reality they were treated like slaves of the state. They were employed on public work projects and so on for quite a while. And that's what happened to many of these ex-soldiers. They were sent off to Rio de Janeiro to another environment, completely different, and employed on public works projects and in a hospital and things like that. some were returned to their former masters. The jerk beef industry expanded greatly after the war. I mean, along with the coffee boom in the central parts of Brazil. And they bought, Rio Grande do Sul bought slaves from other provinces. And there's a very active, as well as they continue importing until 1850, right? There's a very active market for young boys and adolescents. And why is this the case? Because in order to become a good horseman, a good cowboy, you have to start learning very young. So they could be Africans, they could be born in Brazil, that part doesn't matter. They just have to be young. So you literally replace much of the population. Then there are those who continue, who know the routine, who know, okay, the balance of forces has swung back and now we're back to the old routine. So it's best to just kind of work within the system and try to have as good a life as possible and not cause too much trouble, because the punishments can be horrendous. Or, I mean, one of the worst punishment is being sold off into other parts of Brazil. And then you're separated from family and friends. There's also these concerted attempts to recapture people who went off to other countries. I mean, that's what these lists are about. And I think it's, sure, slaves are valuable property, but it's also to demonstrate to the others that running away doesn't pay. We're going to get you one way or another. The habitus of the masters continued. They knew how to divide and individualize slaves, and reward those who cooperated and pit them against one another. So they put them in a situation, and I mean, one paper I wrote on this, in which they're never quite sure if somebody else is going to inform on them. So there are quite a number of conspiracies for rebellion that never actually happen because somebody informs on the others, and then gets rewarded for it. Okay, consequences in São Paulo, and then I will finish. Here you have a real institutional change. You have the end of slavery. There's freedom with no compensation for former slave owners who are really upset about it, and this is part of the reason they participate in the Republican coup that ends the monarchy and establishes the first republic in Brazil. Only 1 year later, in 1889. Without the abolition decree, if you do calculate, there would have been slaves in Brazil until about the 1930s. It would have been a very gradual process. A new confidence and assertiveness of the black population, notions of freedom and citizenship, and we actually find this rhetoric of citizenship emerging among the ex-slaves. Fear and sometimes hatred among the white population, especially the slave owners who feel betrayed and so on. So restoration of slavery is impossible. The masters concentrated on getting the former slaves to go back to work for them, and getting them to accept subordination, demonstrating humility and deference. This often involved violence. I mean, there were cases of lynchings. Nobody really knew about this before, but I found there are not that many, but I didn't look at all of the archives, throughout the entire province. I only looked at a sample of municipalities. I found 5 different cases with 7 victims, and they are obviously imitating the North American lynchings. They're not nearly so many as the thousands you have in the United States. But the same kind of rituals, stringing people, the population, the whole city takes part, and they string people up in the central plaza in front of the church, and mutilating bodies. In similar kinds of circumstances, there are a lot of accusations of sexual crimes, or simply insubordination. Having killed a master is one of the worst things they could do. So there's the extreme violence, then there's a lot of more day-to-day violence. Planters sometimes literally killing black people who seemed insubordinate, who talked back to them, or who swore at them or something like that. It's a time where you have to realize that people only go through life, they only go through history in one direction. We don't know the future, and so that the planter class didn't know it was going to work out for them, that everything was going to be okay. They were really in panic about losing the harvest in the first couple of years after the end of slavery, and about physical threats from former slaves. So there's a lot of proposals that come in from these planters proposing the establishment of concentration camps for freed blacks where they will learn to work, which is really bizarre when you think about what was slavery all about anyway. It's as if they didn't know how to work. But then the authorities didn't really pay much attention to this. What they did was they tended to arrest the more problematic cases, and they were always after these blacks who lived independently, who were always suspected of stealing. And then there's violence against the blacks by groups of Europeans. And this was really the key to restoration, was mass European immigration. There was this intervention in the labor market in which the province, well, the state really after the beginning of the Republic of São Paulo, uses the revenue it gains from coffee exports to pay the passage of poor European immigrants, who are something like 2/3 of them are Italians in the first several years. There's always some others, especially Spanish imported. And then the Italians, because of the conditions, ban subsidized immigration to São Paulo, and then the Spanish become the principal group. Actually, here's the graph. The red line that goes way up is the Italians, in the 1890s. This really takes off after abolition, because with paid passage, what they got was the poorest of the poor, and that's what they wanted. They wanted the poor Europeans who would be completely dependent on the planters. And there's this, Alemães e outras nacionalidades, the Germans and other nationalities, that's really a mixed group. That probably is real Germans in the interwar period, due to chaos in Germany. The first period, well, there's a lot of Russians who are really Polish, mixed in, and since these are everybody arriving in the state of São Paulo, they're not all going to the coffee plantations either. So the Arab immigration is almost entirely to the cities. It's not coffee workers. But what this does is, okay, we're going to have a free labor market, but we're going to control the labor market. And they imported many more workers than they actually needed. Coffee is expanding. They need more people every year, but they imported many more people than they actually needed on the plantations, because people are always abandoning the plantations. They have these annual contracts. At the end of the annual contract, a lot of people go off to the cities. About half of them go back to Europe. Others move to southern Brazil, places like Rio Grande do Sul, where they can enter colonial projects and become small family farmers, which is more attractive to them, or they go to Argentina, where wages are higher. So that they're constantly losing these European workers. And they go to the cities where industry is starting to take off. It's booming. And industry that's controlled largely by European immigrants. In São Paulo, especially the Italians, the larger industries. even in small towns in the interior, you look at the list of the merchants and so on, 2/3 of them are Italians. I mean, it's incredible. They always give preference to people from the same country. So there are these opportunities the European immigrants have that the blacks don't have. They aren't accepted. If they go to Rio Grande do Sul and want to get into a colonial project, they won't accept them. They won't give them land. Very hard time immigrating to Argentina, you know, all these other, and they can get jobs in the city, but it's usually kind of service jobs, you know, cleaning people's houses or cooking or selling stuff on the street, but not the industrial jobs, not the better jobs. This competition with European immigrants is what really, you know, in the minds of the planters, puts the blacks back in their place. You know, it puts them back in a subordinate place. See, I'm talking too long. I just want to talk briefly. What's the new trajectory here? What do people expect? What's sold to the immigrants, and there are a lot of blacks doing the same thing. They're working side by side on the plantation. I mean, this is another one of those historical myths that, you know, the Europeans showed up and the blacks kind of disappeared. No, they're there. But on the plantations, you have a labor system in which the head of the family controls the work of the other. It's a very patriarchal system, and the head of the family also receives all the payment. You know, here's one final image: European immigrants harvesting coffee. You know, doing more or less the same things. You can see child labor. Everybody is barefoot, which means they're vulnerable to worms and so on. There were disease problems I can talk about later if you want. Here it's, the picture is not that clear. I think one of these second family here might be a black family, and the supervisor might be black too. But it's hard to tell because they're in and this photo is quite a bit later. I think it's from the 1930s. Well, okay, the entire family works together so the head of the family likes this system much better than the regimented system from before, and this includes the black families. You know, they have some opportunity to save money, especially because they can, with the young coffee plants, they can plant corn and beans, corn being maize, you know, corn in the U.S. sense of the word, between the rows and then sell the product. And some of them did earn enough money on this, especially when coffee prices were high in the mid-1890s, to buy a small plot of land or a small store in the town or something. But then coffee prices go down, real wages go down, and things get worse. So that they have a fairly stable life. I mean, they're employed, you know, but they're subject to the authority of the planters. The one big benefit that they all emphasize in letters back to Europe and something, nobody goes hungry. I mean, and this is a contrast, you know, with some of the places of origin. We always have plenty of food, plenty of polenta. But those who do become, in the end, small farmers do so largely in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when a lot of the big planters just give up because of the collapse of coffee prices, so they subdivide their plantations and sell them off in small lots and move to the city of São Paulo. So it's a kind of a trajectory that people are promised that doesn't really work out. But it works out for some of the Europeans in the sense that, well, if they move to the city, they can get a somewhat better job, and their children actually can get ahead. So that by the 1930s and 1940s, you have a a process in which the children and grandchildren of European immigrants are really taking over the state of São Paulo. They're taking over local politics, the professions, and so on. Whereas the black population is nowhere to be seen in this. Okay, let me stop. Yes.
So thank you, Karl, for this talk. I think we have a lot of questions, at least I have, but before I will start, maybe